close ties to France following independence in 1960, the development of cocoa production for export, and foreign investment all made Côte d'Ivoire one of the most prosperous of the West African states but did not protect it from political turmoil. In December 1999, a military coup, the first ever in Côte d'Ivoire's history, overthrew the government. Junta leader Robert Gouy attempted to rig the elections held in late 2000 and declared himself the winner. Popular protest forced him to step aside and an election brought Laurent Gbagbo into power. Ivoirian dissidents and disaffected members of the military launched a failed coup attempt in September 2002 that developed into a rebellion and then a civil war. In 2003, a ceasefire resulted in the country being divided with the rebels holding the north, the government the south, and peacekeeping forces a buffer zone between the two. In March 2007, President Gbagbo and former New Forces rebel leader Guillaume Soro signed an agreement in which Soro joined Gbagbo's government as prime minister and the two agreed to reunite the country by dismantling the buffer zone, integrating rebel forces into the national armed forces, and holding elections. Difficulties in preparing electoral registers delayed balloting until 2010. In November 2010, Alassane Dramane Ouattara won the presidential election over Gbagbo, but Gbagbo refused to hand over power, resulting in a 5-month resumption of violent conflict. In April 2011, after widespread fighting, Gbagbo was formally forced from office by armed Ouattara supporters with the help of UN and French forces. The UN peacekeeping mission departed in June 2017. Ouattara is focused on rebuilding the country's economy and infrastructure while rebuilding the security forces. Gbagbo is in The Hague on trial for crimes against humanity.
Geography.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Location: Western Africa, bordering the North Atlantic Ocean, between Ghana and Liberia.
Geographic coordinates: 800N, 500W.
Map references: Africa.
Area total:
322,463 square kilometers.
Land:
318,003 square kilometers.
Water:
4,460 square kilometers.
Country comparison to the world:
70.
Area comparative: slightly larger than New Mexico.
Land boundaries: total
3,458 kilometers.
Border countries: 5.
Burkina Faso 545 kilometers, Ghana 720 kilometers, Guinea 816 kilometers, Liberia 778 kilometers, Mali 599 kilometers.
Coastline: 515 kilometers.
Maritime claims: territorial sea
12.
Exclusive economic zone
200.
Continental shelf
200.
Climate: tropical along coast, semi-arid in far north, 3 seasons, warm and dry, November to March, hot and dry, March to May, hot and wet, June to October.
Terrain: mostly flat to undulating plains. Mountains in northwest.
Elevation: mean elevation
250 m.
Lowest point:
Gulf of Guinea 0 m.
Highest point:
Mont Nimba 1752 m.
Natural resources: petroleum, natural gas, diamonds, manganese, iron ore, cobalt, bauxite, copper, gold, nickel, tantalum, silica sand, clay, cocoa beans, coffee, palm oil, hydropower.
Land use: agricultural land
64.8%,
arable land
9.1%, permanent crops
14.2%, /permanent pasture
41.5%,
forest
32.7%,
other
2.5%.
Irrigated land 730 square kilometers.
Population distribution: the population is primarily located in the forested south, with the highest concentration of people residing in and around the cities on the Atlantic coast. Most of the northern savanna remains sparsely populated with higher concentrations located along transportation corridors.
Natural hazards: coast has heavy surf and no natural harbors. During the rainy season, torrential flooding is possible.
Environment: current issues. Deforestation: most of the country's forests, once the largest in West Africa, have been heavily logged. Water pollution from sewage, and from industrial, mining, and agricultural effluents.
Environment, international agreements, Party to
Biodiversity, climate change, Kyoto Protocol, desertification, endangered species, hazardous wastes, law of the sea, marine dumping, ozone layer protection, ship pollution, tropical timber 83, tropical timber 94, wetlands, whaling.
Signed, but not ratified.
None of the selected agreements.
Geography. Note, most of the inhabitants live along the sandy coastal region. Apart from the capital area, the forested interior is sparsely populated.
People and society.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Population 26,260,582.
Note,
Estimates for this country explicitly take into account the effects of excess mortality due to AIDS. This can result in lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality, higher death rates, lower population growth rates, and changes in the distribution of population by age and sex than would otherwise be expected.
country comparison to the world.
51.
Nationality, noun.
Ivoire-Irians.
Adjective.
Ivoire-Irian.
Ethnic groups. Akan 28.8%, Voltaic-Orga 16.1%, Northern Man 14.5%, Kru 8.5%, Southern Man 6.9%, Unspecified 0.9%, Non-Ivoirian 42.3%.
Languages. French, official, 16 native dialects of which Diaoulou is the most widely spoken.
Religions. Muslim 42.9%, Catholic 17.2%, Evangelical 11.8%, Methodist 1.7%, Other Christian 3.2%, Animist 3.6%, Other religion 0.5%, Non 19.1%.
Note.
The majority of foreign migrant workers are Muslim, 72.7%, and Christian, 17.7%.
Demographic profile. Côte d'Ivoire's population is likely to continue growing for the foreseeable future because almost 60% of the populace is younger than 25. The total fertility rate is holding steady at about 3.5 children per woman, and contraceptive use is under 20%. The country will need to improve education, health care, and gender equality in order to turn its large and growing youth cohort into human capital. Even prior to 2010 unrest that shuttered schools for months, access to education was poor, especially for women. As of 2015, only 53% of men and 33% of women were literate. The lack of educational attainment contributes to Côte d'Ivoire's high rates of unskilled labor, adolescent pregnancy, and HIV/AIDS prevalence.
Following its independence in 1960, Côte d'Ivoire's stability and the blossoming of its labor-intensive cocoa and coffee industries in the southwest made it an attractive destination for migrants from other parts of the country and its neighbors, particularly Burkina Faso. The Houphouët-Boigny administration continued the French colonial policy of encouraging labor immigration by offering liberal land ownership laws. Foreigners from West Africa, Europe, mainly France, and Lebanon composed about 25% of the population by 1998.
Ongoing economic decline since the 1980s and the power struggle after Houphouët-Boigny's death in 1993 ushered in the politics of Ivoire-Iriate, institutionalizing an Ivoire-Irian identity that further marginalized northern Ivoire-Irians and scapegoated immigrants. The hostile Muslim North-Christian South divide snowballed into a 2002 civil war, pushing tens of thousands of foreign migrants, Liberian refugees, and Ivoire-Irians to flee to war-torn Liberia or other regional countries and more than 1 million people to be internally displaced. Subsequently, violence following the contested 2010 presidential election prompted some 250,000 people to seek refuge in Liberia and other neighboring countries and again internally displaced as many as 1 million people. By July 2012, the majority had returned home, but ongoing intercommunal tension and armed conflict continue to force people from their homes.
Age structure 0 to 14 years.
39.59%, Male 5,213,630. Female 5,182,872.
15 to 24 years.
19.91%. Male 2,613,772. Female 2,615,680.
25 to 54 years.
34.25%. Male 4,577,394. Female 4,416,408.
55 to 64 years.
3.47%. Male 460,048. Female 451,604.
65 years and over.
2.78%. Male 325,510. Female 403,664.
Population pyramid.
Population pyramid.
Dependency ratios.
Dependency ratios are a measure of the age structure of a population. They relate the number of individuals that are likely to be economically dependent on the support of others. Dependency ratios contrast the ratio of youths, ages 0-14, and the elderly, ages 65 plus, to the number of those in the working age group, ages 15-64. Changes in the dependency ratio provide an indication of potential social support requirements resulting from changes in population age structures. As a fertility lever. More dependency ratios field listing.
Total dependency ratio.
83.8.
Youth dependency ratio.
78.5.
Elderly dependency ratio.
5.3.
Potential support ratio.
18.9.
Median age, total.
19.9 years.
Male.
20 years.
Female.
19.8 years.
Country comparison to the world.
192.
Population growth rate, 2.3%.
Country comparison to the world.
33.
Birth rate, 30.1 births out of 1,000 population.
Country comparison to the world.
36.
Death rate, 8.4 deaths out of 1,000 population.
Country comparison to the world.
80.
Net migration rate, 1.3 migrants out of 1,000 population.
Country comparison to the world.
57.
Population distribution. The population is primarily located in the forested south, with the highest concentration of people residing in and around the cities on the Atlantic coast. Most of the northern savanna remains sparsely populated with higher concentrations located along transportation corridors.
Urbanization, urban population.
50.8% of total population.
Rate of urbanization.
3.38% annual rate of change.
Major urban areas, population. 4.921 million. Abidjan, seat of government. 231,000 Yamoussoukro, capital.
Sex ratio at birth.
1.03 male every 1 female.
0 to 14 years.
1.01 male every 1 female.
15 to 24 years.
1 male every 1 female.
25 to 54 years.
1.04 male every 1 female.
55 to 64 years.
1.02 male every 1 female.
65 years and over.
0.81 male every 1 female.
Total population.
1.01 male every 1 female.
Mother's mean age at first birth, 19.8 years.
Note.
Median age at first birth among women 25 to 29.
Maternal mortality rate, 645 deaths / 100,000 live births.
Country comparison to the world.
12.
Infant mortality rate, total.
62.6 deaths out of 1,000 live births.
Male.
70.6 deaths out of 1,000 live births.
Female.
54.4 deaths out of 1,000 live births.
Country comparison to the world.
14.
Life expectancy at birth, total population.
60.1 years.
Male.
58 years.
Female.
62.4 years.
Country comparison to the world.
209.
Total fertility rate, 3.83 children born / woman.
Country comparison to the world.
38.
Contraceptive prevalence rate, 23.3%.
Health expenditures, 5.7% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
115.
Physicians density, 0.23 physicians out of 1,000 population.
Drinking water source, improved.
Urban,
93.1% of population.
rural,
68.8% of population.
total,
81.9% of population.
unimproved,
Urban,
6.9% of population.
rural,
31.2% of population.
total.
18.1% of population.
Sanitation facility access, improved.
Urban,
32.8% of population.
rural,
10.3% of population.
total,
22.5% of population.
unimproved,
Urban,
67.2% of population.
rural,
89.7% of population.
total.
77.5% of population.
HIV/AIDS adult prevalence rate, 2.8%.
Country comparison to the world.
19.
HIV/AIDS, people living with HIV/AIDS, 500,000.
Country comparison to the world.
16.
HIV/AIDS deaths, 24,000.
Country comparison to the world.
10.
Major infectious diseases, degree of risk.
Very high.
Food or waterborne diseases.
Bacterial diarrhea, hepatitis A, and typhoid fever.
Vector-borne diseases.
Malaria, dengue fever, and yellow fever.
Water contact diseases.
Schistosomiasis.
Animal contact diseases.
Rabies.
Respiratory diseases.
Meningococcal meningitis.
Obesity. Adult prevalence rate 10.3%.
Country comparison to the world.
138.
Children under the age of 5 years underweight, 12.8%.
Country comparison to the world.
51.
Education expenditures 4.4% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
92.
Literacy, definition.
Age 15 and over can read and write.
Total population.
43.1%.
Male.
53.1%.
Female.
32.5%.
School life expectancy. Primary to tertiary education. Total.
10 years.
Male.
11 years.
Female.
9 years.
Unemployment. Youth ages 15 to 24. Total.
3.9%.
Male.
2.8%.
Female.
5.1%.
Country comparison to the world.
166.
Government.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Country name, conventional long form.
Republic of Côte d'Ivoire.
Conventional short form.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Local long form.
Republique de Côte d'Ivoire.
Local short form.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Former.
Ivory Coast.
Etymology.
Name reflects the intense ivory trade that took place in the region from the 15th to 17th centuries.
Note.
Pronounced Côte d'Ivoire.
Government type, presidential republic.
Capital. Name.
Yamoussoukro. Legislative capital. Abidjan. Administrative capital. Note. Although Yamoussoukro has been the official capital since 1983, Abidjan remains the administrative capital as well as the officially designated commercial capital. The U.S., like other countries, maintains its embassy in Abidjan.
Geographic coordinates.
649 N. 516 Watt.
Time difference.
UK 0. 5 hours ahead of Washington, D.C., during Standard Time.
Etymology.
Named after Queen Yamoussoukro, who ruled in the village of Ngokro in 1929 at the time of French colonization, the village was renamed Yamoussoukro, the suffix kro meaning town in the native Boer language.
Administrative divisions. 12 districts and 2 autonomous districts. Abidjan, Bas-Sassandra, Camo, Dengel, Gajibwa, Lacs, Lagoons, Montans, Sassandra Mara, Savans, Vallée du Bandama, Waroba, Yamoussoukro, Zanzan. Independence.
The 7th of August 1960, from France.
National holiday. Independence Day, 7 August, 1960.
Constitution. History.
Previous 1960, 2000. Latest draft completed the 24th of September 2016. Approved by the National Assembly the 11th of October 2016. Approved by referendum the 30th of October 2016, promulgated the 8th of November 2016.
Amendments.
Proposed by the President of the Republic or by Parliament, consideration of drafts or proposals requires an absolute majority vote by the parliamentary membership. Passage of amendments affecting presidential elections, presidential term of office and vacancies, and amendment procedures requires approval by absolute majority in a referendum. Passage of other proposals by the President requires at least 4/5 majority vote by Parliament. Constitutional articles on the sovereignty of the state and its republican and secular form of government cannot be amended.
Legal system. Civil law system based on the French Civil Code. Judicial review of legislation held in the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court.
International law organization participation. Accepts compulsory ICJ jurisdiction with reservations. Accepts SIC jurisdiction.
Citizenship. Citizenship by birth.
No.
Citizenship by descent only.
At least one parent must be a citizen of Côte d'Ivoire.
Dual citizenship recognized.
No.
Residency requirement for naturalization.
5 years.
Suffrage. 18 years of age. Universal.
Executive branch. Chief of State.
President Alassane Dramane Ouattara, since the 4th of December 2010. Vice President Daniel Kablan Duncan, since the 16th of January 2017. Note: the 2016 Constitution calls for the establishment of the position of Vice President,
Head of Government.
Prime Minister Amadou Gongoulibali, since the 11th of January 2017.
Cabinet.
Council of Ministers appointed by the President.
Elections. Appointments.
President directly elected by absolute majority popular vote in 2 rounds if needed for a 5-year term. No term limits. Election last held on the 25th of October 2015. Next to be held in 2020. Prime Minister appointed by the President. Note: the 2016 Constitution limits the presidential tenure to 2 terms beginning with the 2020 election. The Vice President is named by the President.
Election results.
Alassane Ouattara re-elected President. Percentage vote. Alassane Ouattara, 83.7%. Pascal Affinge San, 9.3%. Conan Burton Adio, Independent, 3.9%. Other 3.1%.
Legislative branch. Description.
Bicameral Parliament consists of
Senate or Senate, 99 seats, 66 members indirectly elected by the National Assembly and members of municipal, autonomous districts, and regional councils, and 33 members appointed by the President. Members serve 5-year terms.
National Assembly, 255 seats, members directly elected in single and multi-seat constituencies by simple majority vote serve 5-year terms.
Elections. Senate, first ever held on the 25th of March 2018, next to be held in 2023.
National Assembly, last held on the 18th of December 2016, next to be held in 2021.
Election results. Senate, percent by party na, seats by party, RHDP 50, Independent 16, composition for elected members only, men 58, women 8. Percent of women 12.1%.
National Assembly, percent of vote by party, RIDE 50.3%, FB 5.8%, UPC 1%, other 1.4%, Independent 38.5%, seats by party, RIDE 167, UPC 6, FB 3, UPC 3, Independent 76, composition, men 228, women 27%. Of women 10.6%. Note: total Parliament percent of women 10.9%.
Note:
the new Constitution of November 2016 called for a bicameral Parliament with the creation of the Senate judicial branch. Judge selection in term of office.
Judges nominated by the Superior Council of the Magistrature, a 7-member body consisting of the National President, Chairman, 3 bench judges, and 3 public prosecutors. Judges appointed for life.
Subordinate courts.
Courts of appeal, organized into civil, criminal, and social chambers, first instance courts, peace courts.
Highest courts.
Supreme Court or Cour Supreme, organized into judicial, audit, constitutional, and administrative chambers, consists of the court president, 3 vice presidents for the judicial, audit, and administrative chambers, and 9 associate justices or magistrates.
Political parties and leaders. Democratic Party of Côte d'Ivoire or PDCI. Henri Conan Bedi.
Ivorian Popular Front or FPI. Former Pres. Laurent Gbagbo.
Liberty and Democracy for the Republic or LIDA. Mamadou Koulibaly.
Movement of the Future Forces or MFA. Innocent Augustin Anaki Kobina.
Rally of Haufatists for Democracy and Peace or RHDP. Alassane Ouattara. Alliance includes MFA, PSI, UPSI, UPSI.
Rally of the Republicans or RDR. Henriette Diabate.
Union for Côte d'Ivoire or UPCI. Naming Conan.
Union for Democracy and Peace in Côte d'Ivoire or UDPSI. Albert Toy Custombury.
International Organization Participation ACP. O, ECOWAS, EITI, Compliant Country, Entente, FAO, FS, G24, G77, EA, IBD, ICAO, ICT, ICM, IDA, IDB, IFAD, IFX, ELO, IMF, IMO, Interpol, IOC, IOM, IPU, ISO, ITSO, ITU, ITUC, NGOs, MIGA, MINUSMA, MONUSCO, NAM, OAK, OIF, OPC, UN, UNCTAD, UNESCO, UNHCR, UNIDO, Union Latina, UN Security Council, TEMPRI, UNUTO, UPU, WOB, Regional, WAMU, WUCO, WUF2, NGOs, WHO, WIPO, WMO, WITO.
Diplomatic representation in the U.S., Chief of Mission.
Ambassador Mamadou Haidara, since the 28th of March 2018.
Chancery.
2424 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20008.
Telephone.
1-202-797-0300.
Fax.
1-202-462-9444.
Diplomatic representation from the U.S., Chief of Mission.
Ambassador, vacant, Charged Affairs Catherine Brooker, since the 28th of August 2017.
Embassy.
730, Abidjan Sidex 01, Republic of Côte d'Ivoire.
Mailing address.
BP 1712, Abidjan 01.
Telephone.
225 22 49 40 00.
Fax.
225 22 49 43 23.
Flag description. 3 equal vertical bands of orange, hoist side, white, and green. Orange symbolizes the land, savanna, of the north and fertility, white stands for peace and unity, green represents the forests of the south and the hope for a bright future.
Note.
Similar to the flag of Ireland, which is longer and has the colors reversed, green, hoist side, white, and orange. Also similar to the flag of Italy, which is green, hoist side, white, and red. Design was based on the flag of France.
National symbol, S, elephant. National colors,
Orange, white, green.
National anthem, name,
L'Abidjanaise, Song of Abidjan.
Lyrics/music,
Mathekra, Joachim Boni, and Pierre-Marie Coty. Pierre-Marie Coty and Pierre-Michel Pango.
Note.
Adopted 1960, although the nation's capital city moved from Abidjan to Yamoussoukro in 1983. The anthem still owes its name to the former capital.
Economy.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Economy overview. For the last 5 years, Côte d'Ivoire's growth rate has been among the highest in the world. Côte d'Ivoire is heavily dependent on agriculture and related activities, which engage roughly 2/3 of the population. Côte d'Ivoire is the world's largest producer and exporter of cocoa beans and a significant producer and exporter of coffee and palm oil. Consequently, the economy is highly sensitive to fluctuations in international prices for these products and to climatic conditions. Cocoa, oil, and coffee are the country's top export revenue earners, but the country has targeted agricultural processing of cocoa, cashews, mangoes, and other commodities as a high priority. Mining gold and exporting electricity are growing industries outside agriculture.
Following the end of more than a decade of civil conflict in 2011, Côte d'Ivoire has experienced a boom in foreign investment and economic growth. In June 2012, The IMF and the World Bank announced $4.4 billion in debt relief for Côte d'Ivoire under the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative.
GDP, purchasing power parity, $97.16 billion.
$90.12 billion.
$83.19 billion.
Note.
Data in 2017 dollars.
Country comparison to the world.
86.
GDP. Official exchange rate. $40.47 billion.
GDP. Real growth rate. 7.8%.
8.3%.
8.8%.
Country comparison to the world.
10.
GDP. Per capita. PPP. $3,900.
$3,700.
$3,500.
Note.
Data are in 2017 dollars.
Country comparison to the world.
179.
Gross national saving. 15.9% of GDP.
19.2% of GDP.
19.5% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
131.
GDP. Composition. By end use. Household consumption.
61.7%.
Government consumption.
14.9%.
Investment in fixed capital.
22.4%.
Investment in inventories.
0.3%.
Exports of goods and services.
30.8%.
Imports of goods and services.
Minus 30.1%.
GDP. Composition. By sector of origin. Agriculture.
20.1%.
Industry.
26.6%.
Services.
53.3%.
Agriculture. Products. Coffee, cocoa beans, bananas, palm kernels, corn, rice, cassava, manioc, tapioca, sweet potatoes, sugar, cotton, rubber, timber.
Industries. Foodstuffs, beverages, wood products, oil refining, gold mining, truck and bus assembly, textiles, fertilizer, building materials, electricity.
Industrial production growth rate. 4.2%.
Country comparison to the world.
71.
Labor force. 8.747 million.
Country comparison to the world.
59.
Labor force. By occupation. Agriculture.
68%.
Unemployment rate. 9.4%.
Country comparison to the world.
135.
Population below poverty line. 46.3%.
Household income or consumption by percentage share. Lowest 10%.
2.2%.
Highest 10%.
31.8%.
Distribution of family income. Gini index. 41.5.
36.7. 1995.
Country comparison to the world.
56.
Budget. Revenues.
7.749 billion.
Expenditures.
9.464 billion.
Taxes and other revenues. 19.1% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
156.
Budget surplus. Plus, or deficit. Minus 4.2% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
159.
Public debt. 47% of GDP.
47% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
112.
Fiscal year. Calendar year.
Inflation rate. Consumer prices. 0.8%.
0.7%.
Country comparison to the world.
40.
Central bank discount rate. 4.25%. The 31st of December 2010.
4.25%. The 31st of December 2009.
Country comparison to the world.
93.
Commercial bank prime lending rate. 5.4%.
5.3%.
Country comparison to the world.
136.
Stock of narrow money. $11.63 billion.
$8.861 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
81.
Stock of broad money. $11.63 billion.
$8.861 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
83.
Stock of domestic credit. $14.56 billion.
$10.9 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
98.
Market value of publicly traded shares. $12.49 billion.
$11.71 billion.
$11.82 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
72.
Current account balance, minus $1.86 billion.
Minus $414 million.
Country comparison to the world.
161.
Exports, $11.74 billion.
$11.77 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
83.
Exports, partners, Netherlands 11.8%, US 7.9%, France 6.4%, Belgium 6.4%, Germany 5.8%, Burkina Faso 4.5%, India 4.4%, Mali 4.2%.
Exports, commodities, cocoa, coffee, timber, petroleum, cotton, bananas, pineapples, palm oil, fish.
Imports, $9.447 billion.
$7.81 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
105.
Imports, commodities, fuel, capital equipment, foodstuffs.
Imports, partners, Nigeria 15%, France 13.4%, China 11.3%, US 4.3%.
Reserves of foreign exchange and gold, $6.257 billion.
$4.935 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
91.
Debt, external, $13.07 billion.
$11.02 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
105.
Stock of direct foreign investment, at home, NA.
Stock of direct foreign investment, abroad, NA.
Exchange rates. Communauté financière African francs, XOF, per US dollar dash.
594.3.
593.01.
593.01.
591.45.
494.42.
Energy.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Electricity access. Population without electricity.
15 million.
Electrification. Total population.
26%.
Electrification. Urban areas.
42%.
Electrification. Rural areas.
8%.
Electricity. Production. 9.73 billion kWh.
Country comparison to the world.
104.
Electricity consumption 6.245 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
114.
Electricity. Exports. 872 million kWh.
Country comparison to the world.
61.
Electricity imports 19 million.
Country comparison to the world.
114.
Electricity. Installed generating capacity. 1.914 million kW.
Country comparison to the world.
114.
Electricity from fossil fuels 60% of total installed capacity.
Country comparison to the world.
130.
Electricity from nuclear fuels. 0% of total installed capacity.
Country comparison to the world.
73.
Electricity from hydroelectric plants 40% of total installed capacity.
Country comparison to the world.
51.
Electricity from other renewable sources. 0% of total installed capacity.
Country comparison to the world.
184.
Crude oil production 54,000 barrels/day.
Country comparison to the world.
50.
Crude oil exports 26,700 barrel day.
Country comparison to the world.
47.
Crude oil imports 62,350 barrels/day.
Country comparison to the world.
52.
Crude oil proved reserves 100 million barrel.
Country comparison to the world.
69.
Refined petroleum products production 69,360 barrels/day.
Country comparison to the world.
72.
Refined petroleum products consumption 51,000 barrel day.
Country comparison to the world.
104.
Refined petroleum products exports 31,450 barrels/day.
Country comparison to the world.
61.
Refined petroleum products imports 7,405 barrel day.
Country comparison to the world.
154.
Natural gas production 2.322 billion qm.
Country comparison to the world.
59.
Natural gas consumption 2.322 billion cubic meters.
Country comparison to the world.
82.
Natural gas exports 0 qm.
Country comparison to the world.
89.
Natural gas imports 0 cubic meters.
Country comparison to the world.
112.
Natural gas proved reserves 28.32 billion qm.
Country comparison to the world.
68.
Carbon dioxide emissions from consumption of energy 11.54 million mount.
Country comparison to the world.
101.
Communications.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Telephones, fixed lines, total subscriptions.
305,562.
Subscriptions per 100 inhabitants.
1.
Country comparison to the world.
111.
Telephones, mobile cellular, total subscriptions.
31,747,233.
Subscriptions per 100 inhabitants.
131.
Country comparison to the world.
42.
Telephone system, general assessment.
Well developed by African standards. Telecommunications sector privatized in late 1990s and operational fixed lines have increased since that time, with 2 fixed line providers operating over open wire lines, microwave radio relay, and fiber optics. 90% digitalized. Côte d'Ivoire continues to benefit from strong economic growth. The fixed internet and broadband sectors have remained lagging.
Domestic.
Less than 1 per 100 fixed line, with multiple mobile cellular service providers competing in the market. Usage has increased sharply to about 131 per 100 persons.
International.
Country code 225. Landing point for the SAT-3/WASC fiber optic submarine cable that provides connectivity to Europe and Asia. Satellite Earth stations, 2 Intelsat, 1 Atlantic Ocean and 1 Indian Ocean.
Broadcast media, 2 state-owned TV stations, no private terrestrial TV stations, but satellite TV subscription service is available. 2 state-owned radio stations, some private radio stations. Transmissions of several international broadcasters are available.
Internet country code.
Internet users, total.
6,297,676.
Percent of population.
26.5%.
Country comparison to the world.
65.
Broadband, fixed subscriptions, total.
142,825.
Subscriptions per 100 inhabitants.
1.
Country comparison to the world.
114.
Transportation.
Côte d'Ivoire.
National Air Transport System. Number of registered air carriers.
1.
Inventory of registered aircraft operated by air carriers.
10.
Annual passenger traffic on registered air carriers.
359,260.
Annual freight traffic on registered air carriers.
4,719,120 Mount km.
Civil aircraft registration country code prefix 2.
Airports. 27.
Country comparison to the world.
125.
Airports, with paved runways, total.
7.
Over 3,047 m.
1.
2,438 to 3,047 m.
2.
1,524 to 2,437 m.
4.
Airports, with unpaved runways, total.
20.
1,524 to 2,437 m.
6.
914 to 1,523 m.
11.
Under 914 m.
3.
Heliports, 1.
Pipelines. 101 kilometers condensate, 256 kilometers gas, 118 kilometers oil, 5 kilometers oil/gas/water. 7 kilometers. Water.
Railways, total.
660 kilometers.
Narrow gauge.
660 kilometers. 1.000 meter gauge.
Note.
An additional 622 kilometers of this railroad extends into Burkina Faso.
Country comparison to the world.
104.
Roadways, total.
81,996 kilometers.
Paved.
6,502 kilometers.
Unpaved.
75,494 kilometers.
Note.
Includes intercity and urban roads. Another 20,000 kilometers of dirt roads are in poor condition and 150,000 kilometers of dirt roads are impassable.
Country comparison to the world.
53.
Waterways, 980 kilometers. Navigable rivers, canals, and numerous coastal lagoons.
Country comparison to the world.
66.
Merchant marine.
Merchant marine may be defined as all ships engaged in the carriage of goods, or all commercial vessels, as opposed to all non-military ships, which excludes tugs, fishing vessels, offshore oil rigs, etc.
Total.
15.
By type.
Oil tanker 2, other 13.
Country comparison to the world.
143.
Ports and terminals. Major seaports.
Abidjan, San Pedro.
Oil terminals.
Espoir offshore terminal.
Military and security.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Military expenditures. 1.18% of GDP.
1.74% of GDP.
1.48% of GDP.
1.38% of GDP.
1.51% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
100.
Military branches. Armed Forces of Côte d'Ivoire. Force Armée de Côte d'Ivoire, FACI.
Army, Navy, Côte d'Ivoire Air Force. Force Aérienne de la Côte d'Ivoire.
Military service age and obligation. 18 to 25 years of age for compulsory and voluntary male and female military service. Conscription is not enforced. Voluntary recruitment of former rebels into the new national army is restricted to ages 22 to 29.
Transnational issues.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Disputes. International. Disputed maritime border between Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana.
Refugees and internally displaced persons, IDPs.
302,000. Post-election conflict in 2010-11, as well as civil war from 2002-4, land disputes, most pronounced in western and southwestern regions.
Stateless persons, 692,000. Ivory Coast.
Or
Côte d'Ivoire.
Officially there.
Republic of Côte d'Ivoire.
Is a country located on the south coast of West Africa. Ivory Coast's political capital is Yamoussoukro in the center of the country, while its economic capital and largest city is the port city of Abidjan. It borders Guinea and Liberia to the west, Burkina Faso and Mali to the north, Ghana to the east, and the Gulf of Guinea Atlantic Ocean to the south. Before its colonization by Europeans, Ivory Coast was home to several states, including Jaraman, the Kong Empire, and Baoul. The area became a protectorate of France in 1843 and was consolidated as a French colony in 1893 amid the European scramble for Africa. It achieved independence in 1960, led by Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who ruled the country until 1993. Relatively stable by regional standards, Ivory Coast established close political and economic ties with its West African neighbors while at the same time maintaining close relations to the West, especially France. Ivory Coast experienced a
coup d'état
in 1999 and two religiously grounded civil wars, first between 2002 and 2007 and again during 2010 to 2011. In 2000, the country adopted a new constitution. Ivory Coast is a republic with strong executive power vested in its president. Through the production of coffee and cocoa, the country was an economic powerhouse in West Africa during the 1960s and 1970s, though it went through an economic crisis in the 1980s. Contributing to a period of political and social turmoil. Only around 2014 has GDP per capita in the country again reached the level of its peak in the 1970s. In the 21st century, the Ivorian economy is largely market-based and still relies heavily on agriculture, with smallholder cash crop production being dominant. The name had long since been translated literally into other languages, which the post-independence government considered increasingly troublesome whenever its international dealings extended beyond the francophone sphere. Therefore, in April 1986, the government declared that Côte d'Ivoire, or, more fully, République de Côte d'Ivoire, would be its formal name for the purposes of diplomatic protocol, and since then officially refuses to recognize or accept any translation from French to another language in its international dealings. Despite the Ivorian government's request, the English translation Ivory Coast often. Ivory Coast is still frequently used in English by various media outlets and publications.
History, land migration.
The first human presence in Ivory Coast has been difficult to determine because human remains have not been well preserved in the country's humid climate. However, newly found weapon and tool fragments, specifically polished axes cut through shale and remnants of cooking and fishing, have been interpreted as a possible indication of a large human presence during the Upper Paleolithic period 15,000 to 10,000 BC, or at the minimum, the Neolithic period. The earliest known inhabitants of Ivory Coast have left traces scattered throughout the territory. Historians believe that they were all either displaced or absorbed by the ancestors of the present indigenous inhabitants, who migrated south into the area before the 16th century. Such groups included the Ahotila Boyaso, Kotro Wu Fresco, Zahiri Grand Lay, Egar and Dies Divo.
Pre-Islamic and Islamic periods.
The first recorded history appears in the chronicles of North African Berber traders, who, from early Roman times, conducted a caravan trade across the Sahara in salt, slaves, gold, and other goods. The southern terminals of the trans-Saharan trade routes were located on the edge of the desert, and from the supplemental trade extended as far south as the edge of the rainforest. The more important terminals, Jen, Gao, and Timbuktu, grew into major commercial centers around which the great Sudanic empires developed. By controlling the trade routes with their powerful military forces, these empires were able to dominate neighboring states. The Sudanic empires also became centers of Islamic education. Islam had been introduced in the western Sudan by Muslim Berber traders from North Africa. It spread rapidly after the conversion of many important rulers. From the 11th century, by which time the rulers of the Sudanic empires had embraced Islam, it spread south into the northern areas of contemporary Ivory Coast. The Ghana Empire, the earliest of the Sudanic empires, flourished in the region encompassing present-day southeast Mauritania and southern Mali between the 4th and 13th centuries. At the peak of its power in the 11th century, its realms extended from the Atlantic Ocean to Timbuktu. After the decline of Ghana, the Mali Empire grew into a powerful Muslim state, which reached its apogee in the early part of the 14th century. The territory of the Mali Empire in Ivory Coast was limited to the northwest corner around Adiene. Its slow decline starting at the end of the 14th century followed internal discord and revolts by vassal states, one of which, Songhai, flourished as an empire between the 14th and 16th centuries. Songhai was also weakened by internal discord, which led to factional warfare. This discord spurred most of the migrations southward toward the forest belt. The dense rainforest covering the southern half of the country created barriers to the large-scale political organizations that had arisen in the north. Inhabitants lived in villages or clusters of villages. Their contacts with the outside world were filtered through long-distance traders. Villagers subsisted on agriculture and hunting.
Pre-European modern period.
5 important states flourished in Ivory Coast during the pre-European early modern period. The Muslim Kong Empire was established by the Julu in the early 18th century in the north-central region inhabited by the Sinufo, who had fled Islamization under the Mali Empire. Although Kong became a prosperous center of agriculture, trade, and crafts, ethnic diversity and religious discord gradually weakened the kingdom. In 1895 the city of Kong would be sacked and conquered by Samarita of the Wassoulou Empire. The Aberon Kingdom of Jaya-Aman was established in the 17th century by an Akan group, the Aberon, who had fled the developing Ashanti Confederation of Asantman in what is present-day Ghana. From their settlement south of Bonduku, the Aberon gradually extended their hegemony over the Diola people in Bonduku, who were recent arrivals from the market city of Begho. Bonduku developed into a major center of commerce and Islam. The kingdom's Quranic scholars attracted students from all parts of West Africa. In the mid-17th century in east-central Ivory Coast, other Akan groups fleeing the Asante established a Baul kingdom at Sakoso and two Agni kingdoms, in Deni and Sanwi. The Baul, like the Ashanti, developed a highly centralized political and administrative structure under three successive rulers. It finally split into smaller chiefdoms. Despite the breakup of their kingdom, the Baul strongly resisted French subjugation. The descendants of the rulers of the Agni kingdoms tried to retain their separate identity long after Ivory Coast's independence. As late as 1969, the Sanwi attempted to break away from Ivory Coast and form an independent kingdom. In 1886, to support its claims of effective occupation, France again assumed direct control of its West African coastal trading posts and embarked on an accelerated program of exploration in the interior. In 1887, Lieutenant Louis-Gustave Bingé began a 2-year journey that traversed parts of Ivory Coast's interior. By the end of the journey, he had concluded 4 treaties establishing French protectorates in Ivory Coast. Also in 1887, Verdier's agent, Marcel Trich-Lapline, negotiated 5 additional agreements that extended French influence from the headwaters of the Niger River basin through Ivory Coast.
French colonial era.
By the end of the 1880s, France had established control over the coastal regions of Ivory Coast, and in 1889 Britain recognized French sovereignty in the area. That same year, France named Trich-Lapline titular governor of the territory. In 1893, Ivory Coast became a French colony, and Captain Bingé was appointed governor. Agreements with Liberia in 1892 and with Britain in 1893 determined the eastern and western boundaries of the colony, but the northern boundary was not fixed until 1947 because of efforts by the French government to attach parts of Upper Volta present-day Burkina Faso and French Sudan present-day Mali to Ivory Coast for economic and administrative reasons. France's main goal was to stimulate the production of exports. Coffee, cocoa, and palm oil crops were soon planted along the coast. Ivory Coast stood out as the only West African country with a sizable population of settlers. Elsewhere in West and Central Africa, the French and British were largely bureaucrats. As a result, French citizens owned 1/3 of the cocoa, coffee, and banana plantations and adopted the local forced labor system. Throughout the early years of French rule, French military contingents were sent inland to establish new posts. Some of the native population and former slave-owning class resisted French settlers. Among those offering greatest resistance was Saint-Marita, who in the 1880s and 1890s was conquering his neighbors, re-establishing slavery and founding the Wassoulou Empire, which extended over large parts of present-day Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Ivory Coast. Saint-Marita's large, well-equipped army, which could manufacture and repair its own firearms, attracted some support throughout the region from chiefs who sought to play the two sides off against each other. The French responded to Saint-Marita's expansion and conquest with military pressure. French campaigns against Saint-Marita, which were met with greater resistance than usual in tribal warfare, intensified in the mid-1890s until he was captured in 1898 and his empire dissolved. France's imposition of a head tax in 1900 to support the colony's public works program provoked unexpected protests. Many Ivoirians saw the tax as a violation of the protectorate treaties because they felt that France was demanding the equivalent of a
coutume
from the local kings, rather than the reverse. Many, especially in the interior, also considered the tax a humiliating symbol of submission. In 1905, the French officially abolished slavery in most of French West Africa. From 1904 to 1958, Ivory Coast was part of the Federation of French West Africa. It was a colony and an overseas territory under the Third Republic. In World War I, France organized regiments from Ivory Coast to fight in France, and colony resources were rationed from 1917 to 1919. Some 150,000 men from Ivory Coast died in World War I. Until the period following World War II, governmental affairs in French West Africa were administered from Paris. France's policy in West Africa was reflected mainly in its philosophy of association, meaning that all Africans in Ivory Coast were officially French subjects, but without rights to representation in Africa or France. French colonial policy incorporated concepts of assimilation and association, based on the assumed superiority of French culture. In practice, the assimilation policy meant the extension of French language, institutions, laws, and customs to the colonies. The policy of association also affirmed the superiority of the French in the colonies, but it entailed different institutions and systems of laws for the colonizer and the colonized. Under this policy, the Africans in Ivory Coast were allowed to preserve their own customs insofar as they were compatible with French interests, such as the recent abolition of the slave trade. An indigenous elite trained in French administrative practice formed an intermediary group between French and Africans. After 1930, a small number of westernized Ivoirians were granted the right to apply for French citizenship. Most Ivoirians, however, were classified as French subjects and were governed under the principle of association. As subjects of France, natives outside the above-mentioned civilized elite had no political rights. They were drafted for work in mines, on plantations, as porters, and on public projects as part of their tax responsibility. They were expected to serve in the military and were subject to their a separate system of law. In World War II, the Vichy regime remained in control until 1942, when British troops invaded without much resistance. Winston Churchill gave power back to members of General Charles de Gaulle's provisional government. By 1943, the Allies had returned French West Africa to the French. The Brazzaville Conference of 1944, the first Constituent Assembly of the Fourth Republic in 1946, and France's gratitude for African loyalty during World War II, led to far-reaching governmental reforms in 1946. French citizenship was granted to all African subjects. The right to organize politically was recognized, and various forms of forced labor were abolished. Between the years 1944 to 1946, many national conferences and constituent assemblies took place between France's Vichy regime and provisional governments in Ivory Coast. Governmental reforms were established by late 1946, which granted French citizenship to all African subjects under the colonial control of the French. Until 1958, governors appointed in Paris administered the colony of Ivory Coast, using a system of direct, centralized administration that left little room for Ivoirian participation in policy making. While British colonial administrations adopted divide-and-rule policies elsewhere, applying ideas of assimilation only to the educated elite, the French were interested in ensuring that the small but influential elite was sufficiently satisfied with their
status quo
to refrain from anti-French sentiment. Although strongly opposed to the practices of association, educated Ivoirians believed that they would achieve equality with their French peers through assimilation rather than through complete independence from France. After the assimilation doctrine was implemented through the post-war reforms, though, Ivoirian leaders realized that even assimilation implied the superiority of the French over the Ivoirians. Some of them thought that discrimination and political inequality would end only with independence. Others thought the problem of the division between the tribal culture and modernity would continue.
Independence.
Felix Houphouët-Boigny, the son of a Belgian chief, became Ivory Coast's father of independence. In 1944, he formed the country's first agricultural trade union for African cocoa farmers like himself. Angered that colonial policy favored French plantation owners, the union members united to recruit migrant workers for their own farms. Houphouët-Boigny soon rose to prominence and within a year was elected to the French Parliament in Paris. A year later, the French abolished forced labor. Houphouët-Boigny established a strong relationship with the French government, expressing a belief that the Ivory Coast would benefit from the relationship, which it did for many years. France appointed him as a minister, the first African to become a minister in a European government. A turning point in relations with France was reached with the 1956 Overseas Reform Act, which transferred a number of powers from Paris to elected territorial governments in French West Africa and also removed the remaining voting inequities. In 1958, Ivory Coast became an autonomous member of the French community, which had replaced the French Union. At independence 1960, The country was easily French West Africa's most prosperous, contributing over 40% of the region's total exports. When Houphouët-Boigny became the first president, his government gave farmers good prices for their products to further stimulate production, which was further boosted by a significant immigration of workers from surrounding countries. Coffee production increased significantly, catapulting Ivory Coast into third place in world output, behind Brazil and Colombia. By 1979, the country was the world's leading producer of cocoa. It also became Africa's leading exporter of pineapples and palm oil. French technicians contributed to the Ivoire-Irian miracle. In other African nations, the people drove out the Europeans following independence, but in Ivory Coast, they poured in. The French community grew from only 30,000 prior to independence to 60,000 in 1980, most of them teachers, managers, and advisors. For 20 years, the economy maintained an annual growth rate of nearly 10%, the highest of Africa's non-oil exporting countries.
Houphouët-Boigny administration.
Houphouët-Boigny's one-party rule was not amenable to political competition. Laurent Gbagbo, who would become the president of Ivory Coast in 2000, had to flee the country in the 1980s, after he incurred the ire of Houphouët-Boigny by founding the Front Populaire Ivoirien. Houphouët-Boigny banked on his broad appeal to the population, who continued to elect him. He was criticized for his emphasis on developing large-scale projects. Many felt the millions of dollars spent transforming his home village, Yamoussoukro, into the new political capital were wasted. Others supported his vision to develop a center for peace, education, and religion in the heart of the country. In the early 1980s, the world recession and a local drought sent shockwaves through the Ivoire-Irian economy. Due to the overcutting of timber and collapsing sugar prices, the country's external debt increased threefold. Crime rose dramatically in Abidjan as an influx of villagers exacerbated unemployment caused by the recession. In 1990, hundreds of civil servants went on strike, joined by students protesting institutional corruption. The unrest forced the government to support multi-party democracy. Houphouët-Boigny became increasingly feeble, and died in 1993. He favored Henri Konan Bedi as his successor.
Bedi administration.
In October 1995, Bedi overwhelmingly won re-election against a fragmented and disorganized opposition. He tightened his hold over political life, jailing several hundred opposition supporters. In contrast, the economic outlook improved, at least superficially, with decreasing inflation and an attempt to remove foreign debt. Unlike Houphouët-Boigny, who was very careful to avoid any ethnic conflict and left access to administrative positions open to immigrants from neighboring countries, Bedi emphasized the concept of
Ivoirite
to exclude his rival Alassane Ouattara, who had two Northern Ivorian parents, from running for future presidential election. As people originating from foreign countries are a large part of the Ivoire-Irian population, this policy excluded many people from Ivoire-Irian nationality, and the relationship between various ethnic groups became strained, which resulted in two civil wars in the following decades.
1999 military coup.
Similarly, Bedi excluded many potential opponents from the army. In late 1999, a group of dissatisfied officers staged a military coup, putting General Robert Gouaille in power. Bedi fled into exile in France. The new leadership reduced crime and corruption, and the generals pressed for austerity and campaigned in the streets for a less wasteful society.
Gbagbo administration.
A presidential election was held in October 2000 in which Laurent Gbagbo vied with Gouaille, but it was not peaceful. The lead-up to the election was marked by military and civil unrest. Following a public uprising that resulted in around 180 deaths, Gouaille was swiftly replaced by Gbagbo. Alassane Ouattara was disqualified by the country's Supreme Court, due to his alleged Burkinabé nationality. The existing and later reformed constitution, under Gouaille, did not allow non-citizens to run for the presidency. This sparked violent protests in which his supporters, mainly from the country's north, battled riot police in the capital, Yamoussoukro.
Ivorian Civil War.
In the early hours of the 19th of September 2002, while the president was in Italy, an armed uprising occurred. Troops who were to be demobilized mutinied, launching attacks in several cities. The battle for the main gendarmerie barracks in Abidjan lasted until mid-morning, but by lunchtime, the government forces had secured Abidjan. They had lost control of the north of the country, and rebel forces made their stronghold in the northern city of Bouake. The rebels threatened to move on Abidjan again, and France deployed troops from its base in the country to stop their advance. The French said they were protecting their own citizens from danger, but their deployment also helped government forces. That the French were helping either side was not established as a fact, but each side accused the French of supporting the opposite side. Whether French actions improved or worsened the situation in the long term is disputed. What exactly happened that night is also disputed. The government claimed that former President Robert Gouin led a coup attempt, and state TV showed pictures of his dead body in the street. Counterclaims stated that he and 15 others had been murdered at his home, and his body had been moved to the streets to incriminate him. Alassane Ouattara took refuge in the German embassy. His home had been burned down. President Gbagbo cut short his trip to Italy and on his return stated, in a television address, that some of the rebels were hiding in the shanty towns where foreign migrant workers lived. Gendarmes and vigilantes bulldozed and burned homes by the thousands, attacking residents. An early ceasefire with the rebels, which had the backing of much of the northern populace, proved short-lived, and fighting over the prime cocoa growing areas resumed. France sent in troops to maintain the ceasefire boundaries, and militias, including warlords and fighters from Liberia and Sierra Leone, took advantage of the crisis to seize parts of the West.
2002 Unity Government.
In January 2003. Gbagbo and rebel leaders signed accords creating a government of national unity. Curfews were lifted, and French troops patrolled the western border of the country. The unity government was unstable, and central problems remained, with neither side achieving its goals. In March 2004, 120 people were killed at an opposition rally, and subsequent mob violence led to the evacuation of foreign nationals. A later report concluded the killings were planned. Though UN peacekeepers were deployed to maintain a zone of confidence, relations between Gbagbo and the opposition continued to deteriorate. Early in November 2004, after the peace agreement had effectively collapsed because the rebels refused to disarm, Gbagbo ordered airstrikes against the rebels. During one of these airstrikes in Bouake, on the 6th of November 2004, French soldiers were hit, and 9 were killed. The Ivorian government said it was a mistake, but the French claimed it was deliberate. They responded by destroying most Ivorian military aircraft, 2 Su-25 planes and 5 helicopters, and violent retaliatory riots against the French broke out in Abidjan. Gbagbo's original term as president expired on the 30th of October 2005. But due to the lack of disarmament, an election was deemed impossible, so his term in office was extended for a maximum of 1 year, according to a plan worked out by the African Union and endorsed by the United Nations Security Council. With the late October deadline approaching in 2006, the election was regarded as very unlikely to be held by that point, and the opposition and the rebels rejected the possibility of another term extension for Gbagbo. The UN Security Council endorsed another 1-year extension of Gbagbo's term on the 1st of November 2006. However, the resolution provided for strengthening of Prime Minister Charles Konan-Banny's powers. Gbagbo said the next day that elements of the resolution deemed to be constitutional violations would not be applied. A peace accord between the government and the rebels, or new forces, was signed on the 4th of March 2007, and subsequently Guillaume Soro, leader of the new forces, became prime minister. These events were seen by some observers as substantially strengthening Gbagbo's position. According to UNICEF, at the end of the civil war, water and sanitation infrastructure had been greatly damaged. Communities across the country required repairs to their water supply.
2010 election.
The presidential elections that should have been organized in 2005 were postponed until November 2010. The preliminary results announced independently by the President of the Electoral Commission from the headquarters of Ouattara due to concern about fraud in that commission. They showed a loss for Gbagbo in favor of former Prime Minister Alassane Ouattara. The ruling FPI contested the results before the Constitutional Council, charging massive fraud in the northern departments controlled by the rebels of the new forces. These charges were contradicted by United Nations observers unlike African Union observers. The report of the results led to severe tension and violent incidents. The Constitutional Council, which consisted of Gbagbo supporters, declared the results of 7 northern departments unlawful and that Gbagbo had won the elections with 51% of the vote, instead of Ouattara winning with 54%, as reported by the Electoral Commission. While the African Union also suspended the country's membership. In 2010, a colonel of the Ivory Coast Armed Forces, Nesson Yao, was arrested in New York in a year-long U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement operation charged with procuring and illegal export of weapons and munitions, 4,009mm handguns, 200,000 rounds of ammunition, and 50,000 tear gas grenades, in violation of a UN embargo. Several other Ivory Coast officers were released because they had diplomatic passports. His accomplice, Michael Barry Shua, an international trader, was located in Virginia.
2011 Civil War.
The 2010 presidential election led to the 2010 to 2011 Ivorian crisis and the Second Ivorian Civil War. International organizations reported numerous human rights violations by both sides. In the city of Côte, hundreds of people were killed. In nearby Blolekin, dozens were killed. UN and French forces took military action against Gbagbo. Gbagbo was taken into custody after a raid into his residence on the 11th of April 2011. The country was severely damaged by the war, and observers say it will be a challenge for Ouattara to rebuild the economy and reunite Ivorians. Gbagbo was taken to the International Criminal Court in The Hague in January 2016. He was declared acquitted by the court but given a conditional release in January 2019. Belgium has been designated as a host country.
Geography.
Ivory Coast is a country of Western Sub-Saharan Africa. It borders Liberia and Guinea in the west, Mali and Burkina Faso in the north, Ghana in the east, and the Gulf of Guinea Atlantic Ocean in the south. The country lies between latitudes 4 degrees and 11 degrees N, and longitudes 2 degrees and 9 degrees W. Around 64.8% of the land is agricultural land, arable land amounted to 9.1%, permanent pasture 41.5%, and permanent crops 14.2%. Water pollution is amongst one of the biggest issues that the country is currently facing.
Administrative divisions.
Since 2011, Ivory Coast has been administratively organized into 12 districts plus 2 district-level autonomous cities. The districts are divided into 31 regions, the regions are divided into 108 departments, and the departments are divided into 510 sub-prefectures. In some instances, multiple villages are organized into communes. The autonomous districts are not divided into regions, but they do contain departments, sub-prefectures, and communes. Since 2011, governors for the 12 non-autonomous districts have not been appointed, and as a result these districts have not yet begun to function as governmental entities. The following is the list of districts, district capitals and each district's regions.
Environment, politics.
The government is divided into 3 branches, the executive power, the legislative power, and the judicial power. In the legislative branch, Guillaume Soro directs the 2016 National Assembly and its 225 members, elected for 5-year terms. Since 1983, Ivory Coast's capital has been Yamoussoukro, while Abidjan was the administrative center. Most countries maintain their embassies in Abidjan. The Ivorian population has suffered because of the ongoing civil war. International human rights organizations have noted problems with the treatment of captive non-combatants by both sides and the re-emergence of child slavery in cocoa production. Although most of the fighting ended by late 2004, the country remained split in two, with the north controlled by the new forces. A new presidential election was expected to be held in October 2005, and the rival parties agreed in March 2007 to proceed with this, but it continued to be postponed until November 2010 due to delays in its preparation. elections were finally held in 2010. The first round of elections was held peacefully, and widely hailed as free and fair. Runoffs were held the 28th of November 2010, after being delayed 1 week from the original date of 21 November. Laurent Gbagbo as president ran against former Prime Minister Alassane Ouattara. On 2 December, the Electoral Commission declared that Ouattara had won the election by a margin of 54% to 46%. In